Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. Today's video is inspired by an Instagram post I came across yesterday. It features a scene with the actors Eileen Atkins and Emma Thompson. Emma Thompson is in the scene recalling, I think, a conversation. I think this is a memory, recalling a conversation with a professor of hers, chastising her for using the incorrect edition of John Donne's Divine Sonnets. And as you can see from the closed captioning here, the amazing phrase inauthentically punctuated appears. Eileen Atkins then goes on to give a long speech about why it matters that the punctuation in the edition she recommends prefers commas to semicolons. And while the early part of the scene seems somewhat exaggerated and ridiculous, the scene closes with a somewhat interesting, honest, and moving interpretation of that really hinges on what punctuation marks one should use when printing and reading and studying John Donne's work. So that led me to wonder if the edition referenced in the film actually existed. I'm not an early modern scholar, so I didn't know. And sure enough, it does. On the right side of the screen here, this is the edition of the Holy Sonnet that they're talking about in that was edited by Helen Gardner. And then on the left side of the screen here, you see the version of the sonnet that appears on Poetry Foundation. When I was a student, I remember reading this sonnet when I was an undergraduate, and I remember reading it as Holy Sonnet number 10. As you can see, Gardner renumbers it number 6. And so if you Google Holy Sonnet 6 or Holy Sonnet 10, you might actually get a completely different poem. And this numbering issue became I think so prevalent in the reception of Donne in the 20th century that if you look at the Poetry Foundation website, it doesn't have a number at all. So some editions, some printings of this sonnet just completely do away with numbering altogether. And that has a lot to do with the manuscripts, the source material that Gardner was working from when preparing this edition. So how about we read the Poetry Foundation edition? I'll pull this screen to the left so that we can focus our attention here, and then we'll read Gardner's edition. And then if that doesn't take half an hour, I might start taking some notes on Donne's poem. But maybe just sticking with the process of reading aloud and some observations about punctuation will be enough for today. We'll see. So here it is. This is Holy Sonnet. Holy Sonnet, when I was an undergraduate, number 10, in Gardner's edition, number 6, here unnumbered, Death be not proud. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow die not, poor Death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. Then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go. Rest of their bones, and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Okay, now let's look at Gardner's edition. I'm working from a PDF here that I've opened in Chrome, so I can't actually use Hypothesis to mark it up, but there is a sort of handy tool here which I can potentially use if I want to. All right, here we go. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, For thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. Then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death thou shalt die. Okay. Let's check out these two editions, because I think one thing we might learn from just looking at them side by side is maybe my approach to letting punctuation guide my oral sort of performance of the poems is pretty historically and culturally specific. Maybe I overdo my attention to punctuation, and yet I think a careful study of the difference of the punctuation actually helps us understand how different the poems can also sound. Whether or not that difference rises to the level of competing interpretations that we see in the monologue of Eileen Atkins's character in the film that's featured in that Instagram post. Whether or not that's the case, I'll leave that to Dunn scholars, and we'll see. Maybe a future video down the road. I think right off the bat, you can see that there's a difference in how the poem begins. Now, again, it's very possible that it would be convention in the early modern period to pause after that first word. But think for just a second how different this line sounds right out the gate. Death, pause, be not proud. So that immediate sort of personifying address to death, that apostrophizing address to death, um, carries with it a kind of polite, almost reverential. I'm probably projecting these qualities onto the pause, but there's a way in which that seems a kind of conventional way to address someone in the first line, or address something in the first line of a poem. Death, pause, be not proud. Whereas the edition in Gardner's text, death be not proud. There's a again, it doesn't feel as natural to me to just read that through. It feels like I should pause, but it's not a pause governed by a punctuation mark. It would have to be just a blip if you're going to do it. Otherwise, just death be not proud. And so that you get a kind of, this is not a word Donne would have used this way, I don't think, although I would have to check the OAD. The vibe is profoundly different just in those first four words. Okay. All right. Well, what if we move then to the next line? We see, of course, spelling is different, but I'm not going to get into that. But the punctuation is very different. We have a pause before and after the for here, where that is not the case here. And again, this might be conventions of modern pronunciation, modern rhythm. Maybe again in the early modern period, it would be conventional to just not pause at this comma. But again, feel the difference in the rhythm. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. So you do have a kind of pause there that's almost about the speaker having worked themselves up and coming then to slow down. And it also emphasizes the degree to which, uh, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, is this aside, and the main sentence, death be not proud, for thou art not so, for those um, die not, right? So you're getting the sense of the syntax that's much more kind of um, broken up in Gardner's edition by these commas. I mean, think of just even the next line, which has no punctuation in it in the Poetry Foundation edition, has 4 commas in it at the end of the line, and then 3 in kind of the first, I don't know, 2/3 of the line or so. And so I think to a modern reader, contemporary reader, someone who's trained in sort of later modern English, that sheer number of commas there is just so interesting. Um, and so you don't get the kind of rush, but instead a kind of reading that, if you go by my own conventions for reading aloud, is almost unnatural. Like it's actually hard for me to read this line in Gardner's edition. Let's try it again. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not. And then that's maybe where I get hung up. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, you can see why one might be encouraged to take out all those commas, because it feels like maybe you should be reading that through. Thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. There is this like, yeah, halting pace to the thinking in those lines that are not here in Poetry Foundation. The punctuation in the next line's basically the same, except here we have a period, and in this edition there's a semicolon. Now let's go into the next line. The punctuation looks pretty identical. So 2 commas here, 2 commas there. Um, this seems to be a difference of some import. A semicolon, whereas there's a comma here, which does not exist in this edition. All right, so let's go back. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. Then from thee, much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. I really like that. Now, what's it sound like here again? From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. I wonder why a semicolon here, because that doesn't feel right to me. So you can see I'm kind of bouncing back and forth. Um, and also no comma after thee. I like the comma here. Then from thee, almost like a question, almost a half question, or the vibe of a question. Then from thee, much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go. So that line's the same, and the punctuation here is the same as well. Again, I'm not too concerned about the difference between early modern indication of possession, or, the more recent version of using the apostrophe to indicate possession. Not concerned with that so much. Apostrophes don't really affect how you sync up, or how you sync up, how you modify or anticipate the rhythm of a line, in the same way that a comma, period, semicolon, colon, dash, the way these marks do. And then the next line again is basically the same, although one big difference, which is not about punctuation, concerns capitalization. In this edition, fate is capitalized, indicating the kind of personified divine entity or set of entities known as fate. So there's an actor here with a kind of agency, whereas when you don't capitalize it, fate is a kind of pilotless um, destination or mapping out of one's life. And so the decapitalizing fate sort of removes the sense of a kind of, even if it's mythic, a kind of actor or agent that's doing something. Um, okay, so that's interesting. And desperate men and dust with poison war and sickness dwell. I also really like this this punctuation mark, this comma, which is not here in the Poetry Foundation edition. Um, and dust with poison, war, and sickness dwell. That's identical between the two lines, but here, I don't know. I really like it. And dust with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charm. It gives you a kind of way to sort of pause there. Or charms can make us sleep as well. So you get the poppy, which is kind of a specific noun, or charms, a kind of more general noun. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, comma at the end of this line, and better than thy stroke. And so here this is enjammed in the Poetry Foundation, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke, a kind of breathless rush in those two lines, whereas here that is not the case. Or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke, although both include a semicolon. Note that this is the only semicolon. The only one, oh no, I'm lying. The second, sorry, second semicolon in Gardner's edition. But here, this is a, this we could think of this as a kind of conventional semicolon since it comes at the end of a quatrain, the end of a quatrain, as does the period here. But then here, you have a semicolon indicating a hard caesura, sort of like emphasize caesura there, a strong pause that then leads into a question that brings us to the closing couplet. And that couplet is very different. And everything hinges in the scene if you watch that whole clip. Then maybe I'll put in if I can get a link to that Instagram post, I might put that in the video description. One short sleep past, and we wake eternally, all the same until the end. Because this is enjammed, this is not. One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. That's how Poetry Foundation reads. But in Gardner's edition, one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. And here you get the sense of a hard kind of reposition to address death again. But just like we have at the beginning of the poem, no comma, sort of getting us to pause after the direct address, we don't have it at the end either. Here, and death shall be no more. Death, pause, thou shalt die. Is the vibe different here? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Death, thou shalt die. So you have death, thou shalt die. It's almost like that closing couplet has like the four parts to it, right? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Whereas that is kind of broken up, that organization, by the addition of the comma after death and by taking away that comma here. So that instead we have a opening phrase set off by a comma, a closing phrase set off by a semicolon, and then an enjammed phrase that's longer in the middle. which seems far less grammatically and mechanically organized and crafted, at least to me at the moment, than what we see in the closing lines of the version that Gardner thinks is closer and more authoritative, or closer to a more authoritative manuscript than this edition. Of course, this edition I think dates to 1952. And again, I'm not a John Donne scholar or even an early modern scholar, so I have no idea what people have come to think of the sort of variance of this poem across manuscripts and across editions. I have no idea what a Donne scholar prefers. But I think for me, as I'm kind of working through these two versions, I think there's only one instance where I kind of prefer the Poetry Foundation's edition here, which might be a kind of standard, more sort of wider, an edition that has more eyes on it than this one. Uh, I kind of prefer this line to the line 3 of Gardner's, but I think other than that, I really prefer this version. I kind of like the vibe of it more than this one. And I say that as someone who really, really likes enjambment. And there's far fewer, if we were going to do some bean counting, which I've kind of been doing out loud without taking any actual notes. Um, if we were doing bean counting, one thing we would notice is that in this edition, only one line, the first line, is enjambed. The rest, just scan down it, all have a punctuation mark. Whereas in this edition, line 1, line 3, um, line 11, and line 13 are all enjambed. So fewer than 50%. So most lines, even in this edition, are punctuated at the end and have a punctuated pause. But there's a pretty big difference between one and how many, 4 or 5 in this edition. All right. Okay, well, I think I'm gonna call it there. This is maybe a different approach to how I usually do these videos, but it also teaches us a good lesson that I tend not to, maybe tends not to be as pressing in most of the poems I've looked at in my channel's videos so far. And it's something that is actually pretty hard to teach students to care about, because it can feel, as the scene in this film initially feels, really persnickety and elitist and snobby to make such a big deal about what version of a text you're looking at. Um, but I hope, if nothing else, this video has at least been interesting for wondering and exploring how really small differences, just in punctuation, which, as you know, I love paying attention to, winds up having pretty profound effects on how we feel the vibe of a poem, how we interface with it, and maybe, if we get far enough, what meaning we draw from it, and what wisdom we end up hearing. All right. Well, thanks for spending time with me and John Donne. Thanks to John Donne for writing this poem all those centuries ago. And hey, let's read more poems tomorrow.